Hello everyone, this is Jack Grayle. Welcome to the second Midnight Orpheum video in which we discuss Robert Louis Stevenson's terrifying short story, Thrawn, Janet. And if you haven't listened to it yet, there'll be spoilers in the upcoming videos. So instead, why don't you look in the comments and you can find a link to the free audio narration I did of that wonderful short story, Thrawn, Janet. All right, we're going to discuss the sort of the esoteric takeaways of the story, or at least the ones I saw. All right, I'm sure you may see some different or additional ones. This story is absolutely terrifying. I don't know if you feel the same way I do, but at least I feel the way Robert Louis Stevenson did, because after he wrote it, he read it to his wife by candlelight at night, and then the two of them clung to each other as they went up to bed and lie awake. They scared themselves so they couldn't even sleep just by him reading and her listening to the story for the first time. It's wonderful. Really, really well written. It's a fantastic story. And if you take the time to read or listen to it, you'll discover that Thrawn, Janet is a tale about this sort of uptight young minister who doesn't believe in supernatural things until he comes across the local women in this small Scottish village trying to dunk his housemaid, his housekeeper, Janet, whom they view as a witch, and he quickly breaks it up. But to show them she's not a witch, he makes her swear that she rejects the devil, and she's reluctant to do it, but he makes her do it. And when she does, with a stricken look, she disappears for the night. And when she appears the next day, walking out of the local woods, her neck is thrawn. And thrawn is a Scottish term for distorted or twisted or torqued, right? So her head's at a cocked angle, and her face, with eyes and tongue and everything, it looks like she's been hanged. But she comes out of the woods, and whenever she speaks, it's sort of a throttled rasp. And a rumor starts to go around that she died that night by her own hand, and that she's inhabited and sort of, animated by the devil himself. This is a terrifying, terrifying concept. And the ending is fantastic. But there were a couple things, there's a couple classic things in there that totally caught my eye or ear, if you will. And the first is this idea of dunking a witch, right, which they also called swimming a witch, which was, of course, this absolutely atrocious test of witchhood that developed out of the witch trials, in the late Renaissance. And it had in its concept this strange idea that as witches rejected supposedly their baptism, the water would then reject the witch. And so if you threw a witch, say, in a pond and she sank, well, then she was a normal person, like you or me. But if she floated, that was the waters rejecting her. And so it was a sign that she was a witch and could presumably be punished or killed. And it also tied in with this idea that witches were in their very nature different than people. They weren't actually flesh and blood. They looked like it, but they weren't. And that's why you could, supposedly one of the tests is to push pins in their body, because supposedly they couldn't feel it, because they weren't built like us. And if you threw them in the water, they floated, because it was like they were made of cork or wood or something like that. And there were all these odd theories, and James I of Scotland, was definitely one who spread that knowledge and who admired books like Malleus Maleficarum. And he himself had suspected that witches had tried to make his family shipwreck when he was young. And so James I was very much all about rooting out witchcraft and demolishing it and writing against it and all that sort of thing. And it was to please him that Shakespeare wrote the play Macbeth, which of course begins with the three famous witches, when shall we three meet again, in thunder, lightning, or in rain? And it was to satisfy his obsession with this idea of witchcraft and demonology and that sort of thing. So, swimming a witch, as is done to Janet in here, this idea of throwing them in the water, this esoteric idea that there's something in their very nature that makes a witch different from the rest of us. And of course, in the story, it gets interrupted. But then the irony is the minister, very conscientiously stops them from swimming Janet. But then But then it turns out when he makes her swear against the devil, he triggers something. And we can't help but come to the conclusion that Janet was indeed involved with dark forces and perhaps even had a pact with the devil. Because toward the end of the book, not only does her Thrawn neck and her behavior reveal that something strange has happened, but at the climax of the book, when the narrator or the main character, the minister, walks into Janet's room, he sees her, spoiler, hanging in a corner, as if she's hanged herself. But when he gets closer, he sees that she's hung herself by a thread. And something about that fact, it just sends shivers up my spine. I just got them right now. But it ties into that idea that a true witch in the supernatural sense is not made of the same material that you or I are, like she's made out of pumice or cork, right? She can be suspended once hung by a single thin thread. And Robert Louis Stevenson, some speculate that he wrote these supernatural stories, that reinforced, the Orthodox doctrine or Christian doctrine, was sort of a sop to his parents, because when he was in the equivalent of college, he had joined a group that was all about atheism and rejecting the religion of our parents and rationalism. And when his parents found out, they're absolutely mortified and told him in no uncertain terms that they absolutely had abjectly failed when they realized he had joined this group. And he was deeply ashamed because he loved his parents. Robert Louis Stevenson was sick most of his life. He didn't live to an old age, but he didn't let that stop him. He traveled all over the world. He spent a good amount of time in America. And he wrote, besides these fantastic ghost stories, he wrote stories like Kidnapped and Treasure Island, which became classics of the genre. And even though they were dismissed by critics as mere entertainments, they have long outlived books that the critics thought, were high literature, grand literature, and his work is being reevaluated today. And what's interesting is for those people who, like their writers to sort of sync up with your own values, often it's hard to find one when you look 100, 200, 300 years back, because their culture was so different that oftentimes the language they used or their views of other people or the way they it sort of, can make our gag reflex kick in. But Robert Louis Stevenson wasn't like that, which is remarkable. He wound up in Samoa. He traveled all the way to the opposite side of the world and made his home in Samoa. And unlike many British people who would view natives as this sort of bizarre, entertaining species, he really genuinely felt for and felt a deep bond with the Samoan people. And at the time he went to Samoa, there were all kinds of English and Dutch traders who was, of course, trying to snatch up Samoan lands, because the Samoans didn't cultivate their lands largely. They utilized it for food or for hunting, but they didn't cultivate, and that was letting the English and the Dutch claim it. And so Robert Louis Stevenson, to his credit, recognized that what was happening to these Samoans, these brave and hardy mountain people, was what happened to the Scottish Highlanders, because he was Scottish, when the British came to take their property. And so he made it a point of befriending the native peoples there and advising them that they had to cultivate, they had to find a way to put their mark on the land in order to defend it from the predations of the colonists that came from Britain and Europe. And they recognized, the Samoans, that he was telling them the truth, and they understood him to be their ally. And he wound up translating some of his stories into Samoan so they could read them, and he lived among them until he died. And when he died, they gave him a Samoan funeral, and they celebrated him with a headstone there that remembered him as a friend of them. So it's actually a really cool story about someone who, even though he lived in what many would consider benighted times, actually felt a deep, passionate, concern for people that weren't at all like him, and he saw the ways they were, despite the fact that many aspects of their life would have seemed completely foreign and exotic to people like him. So a very perceptive person, a very compassionate person, very much a colorblind person, an enormously talented writer. And Thrawn Janet shows how he can send a shiver down the spine. So the first esoteric point I wanted to make was, of course, this idea of the witch being other, of being not just different in her head, but in her body and the composition and the DNA and the actual elemental makeup of her form. Okay. And that difference, can be seen not only in how, she hangs and how they try to drown her, but by the remarkable reveal at the end, which, spoiler, shows that Janet is inhabited by a dark power, the dark power of the devil himself, the black man. And this character, the black man, which is referred to very often in the witch trials, doesn't necessarily refer to someone of African descent. It was more someone who dressed in black, had a dark visage. Sometimes they'll say black from head to foot, but it's very much sort of an uncanny blackness and not like a nationality. And you can see this in the witch trials when people would talk about their familiar or the spirit that granted them their powers. It's varied. Sometimes it's an angel that came to them, sometimes a spirit of the dead, sometimes an animal, sometimes it was one of the good folk, right? And other times it was the devil or the black man. And what you often find in these stories is the farther geographically north you go, the more likely it is to be the devil in the British Isles. And Scotland was especially known for having a terror of witches and associating them very much with diabolical powers. And it's curious, why a black man? And there's some people that said that might be a memory of back when the Moors were, the Moors were occupying parts of Spain and elsewhere, and they were fighting and stuff. But it goes far beyond that. If you look at the Mabinogion and old Welsh tales, when the hero, the earliest Arthurian stories, when heroes go to encounter aspects of the Grayle maiden, often one of the aspects, besides being a beautiful princess or a gorgeous, angel, is a character like Kundry, who's a black hag, right, or crone, and she stands for the death force, and she often tests people. She might live on a black island in a black tower, in a black casket, and there are black knights that rise out of the earth that will attack the hero. And these are, of course, earth powers, chthonic powers that challenge the hero to rise above his circumstance and be braver than he thought he can, and to battle the powers of death, of course, because often the hero and the powers the hero is trying to align himself with are powers of life, solar powers, powers of health and vigor, And so this black man, very much a chthonic figure and redolent of and parallel to similar figures in myths that far, far predate the witch trials. Okay. I've always thought there was an interesting possibility too, which is that, of course, Scotland at this time would have been deeply, deeply Protestant. And if you notice in the story where the minister encounters the black man, the devil, he encounters it in a kirkyard, a churchyard that was consecrated by papists. Papists, of course, would have been Catholics before King Henry V drove them out of the British Isles. And so this idea that the devil is encountered in a papist churchyard, it very much reveals that, the diabolical center is these defunct and ruined Catholic churches and abbeys that haunted the landscape of Britain after they were purged in the Anglican Reformation. And it's interesting too, because at the time of the witch trials, Catholicism would have been referred to as the old faith. And people, though it would have been several generations before that it was abolished, people would remember snatches of hymns and bits of Latin, and they would have used them and recited them or written them as magical charms. There was still a memory of that. And there had to be a memory, too, of the priests themselves, whom, it goes without saying, would have been dressed all in black, the black robes. And it's interesting to think that perhaps some of the legendary black man, this idea of meeting a diabolical persona dressed in black upon the hill, might have been at least informed by the distant memory, generations old, of the old faith, at least in Britain, and those black-clad men who were the dispensers of the host and those types of things. So, I mean, it's just an idea, but it's one that sort of haunts me sometimes. But anyway, there's some other remarkable ideas in this, and one of the ones that struck me the most, final spoiler, is that it's revealed at the end that this husk that is Janet is actually occupied and animated like a puppet by the devil. All right? And so there's this idea that a dead body, because the implication is Janet, after she broke her oath to the devil, or pact, and forswore him, that night Janet went into the woods and hanged herself, and then the corpse was animated by the devil and came back and lived with the minister at his house. Absolutely horrifying idea. But this idea of a corpse or a part of a dead body being animated wasn't invented by Robert Louis Stevenson. And there's lots of in every culture, this idea of a skull or bones being haunted, retaining some of the spirit that perhaps adheres to it, especially if it died violently or young, and in a typical fashion that would lead to a ghost or a restless spirit to haunt the place where they had lived before. But to look at a more developed culture, all we have to do is look at Southeast Asia. And here I'm going to recommend a wonderful book. And full disclosure, this is an edition that I edited and published through Araxes Press with my friend Larry Roberts of Miskatonic Books. And this is a Thai Occult 1, all right? It's a beautiful, beautiful production by Peter Jenks and translated by Bon. And if you haven't heard of it before, it's just remarkable, because in it they interview dozens of these practitioners of Buddhist folk magic, some of whom were Buddhist monks, and they describe in their own words the process that they avail themselves of. But to the point, there's something called Panang in this tradition of Buddhist folk magic, and Panang is a piece of a human skull carved out of it, usually small and round. And that Panang can be used as a magical charm for several different reasons, and it can be decorated, and if it comes from the area where the third eye would be, it's of particular power, and depending on the type of person it came from, it can have increased, energy and increased volatility and increased possibilities of how it can respond. But what's interesting is it's not in all traditions considered to be haunted by the actual ghost that it came from. Listen to this. I'm quoting from the book. It says, there is a difference between the Lana Wicha for Panang and the Wicha from the other regions. So they're talking about different regions of Thailand and the different styles of magic and the areas around there. Nowadays, in the other regions, the Panang will be obtained, and then the spirit that inhabits it will be constructed by the Ajarn, the magician, using the 32 parts of the body spell. But in Lana Wicha, the spirit in the Panang would be the owner of the skull. And if that spirit has passed on, another ghost in the graveyard would be invited in, meaning the true Lana Panang do not have a spirit that has been constructed by the Ajarn. So the implication here, of course, is that the magicians themselves, the skull itself, in some traditions, is more like the shell of a hermit crab. It can be occupied by a spirit that is either created by the magician, or a different ghost that inhabits it, or the ghost of the person themselves who passed away, that is of the Panang. It can serve as a host for a spirit. So, something to think of, and something to remind us that these remarkable stories do intersect with the world of esotericism, with folk magic, traditional witchcraft, legend, myth, and literature, in a way where all of them combine in this beautiful braid that creates something remarkable, terrifying, fascinating, beautiful, and of wonder. So, If you have some bones lying in the house, good for you, but be careful, because according to this story and that book, they could serve, of course, as the host to a resident spirit. And if that's not a spirit of your inviting or your making, well, it might be the spirit of someone else's. A word to the wise. But thank you for listening. Thanks for listening to Thrawn Janet, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Midnight Orpheum.